He was born actually in 1836 in Cambridge, Boston. He comes from an interesting family. They're sort of middle class Americans, but his father was a terrible failure. I mean, there were quite a few brothers, and they were basically involved with the sort of the maritime business, really, because Boston is a great port, and the brothers were all involved with mostly to do with the South, to do with cotton and so on. But they was really sort of. But his father was a kind of a. I suppose he felt himself to be an inventor or something. He went for the gold rush and things like this, and he was always losing money. The mother came from a different, but they were sort of educated American. So he was always, his family was poor, but I mean that he came from a relatively wealthy family. The others were wealthy. And it gave him a sort of a sense of himself. But he was bad at school. He was terribly had two elder brothers, and they were very clever. They both went to Harvard, and one became a sort of civil servant, really. And I think the other was an engineer. But they were clever. But he wasn't. He wasn't good. He said he sort of played about, really. And in the end, his father apprenticed him to a lithographer. Now, lithography had just begun to be popular because the newspapers were suddenly getting important. He was apprenticed to this lithographer. And really, he's completely self-taught. This is the amazing thing about him, because he literally learned. There were a slightly older lithographer who had been trained as an artist, and he helped him a little bit, but basically he literally learned himself, taught himself. Let's put the first ones on and you can see what I mean. This is quite remarkable, really. Now, the one on the left is very, very early. To begin with, he was in this lithography place in Boston, but in 1859, he went to New York, where the Harper's Weekly were a magazine, and they were beginning to be the most popular magazine. And this very first one is skating in New York City, and this is in Harper's in 1859. Now here's a man who literally had to teach himself to draw, and it's quite remarkable. The one on the right, I think, is even more so, and this is Pruning the Tree. And this is 1860. Now, interestingly, he was the American Civil War started in 1861, and it started really because of slavery. The North literally wanted to abolish slavery, and there was a terrible scandal in that an escaped slave he was called Burns, and he came to Boston, and he was found by the local police, and because he was owned by his master, he was sent back to the South, and this caused such an incredible scandal that it really began to determine the way that we're going to see Homer looking at the war.
Human rights, yeah.
This became his most important bit about it. And the war actually was, by the time he was drawing this one on the right, which was 60s, there was no doubt about it, the war was going to start. And it started in 61. And he was sent by this Harper's Weekly, he was sent to Virginia to really cover the war. And so we're going to see the next ones, which are really about this war. I think this one is very sweet. This is the Harper's Weekly, a journal, Journal of Civilization, which I think is rather interesting. And you see this is 61. And if you remember the Second World War, we used to make socks for soldiers, or people did make socks for soldiers. And this is precisely what's happening. Look at all these well-dressed ladies making sort of, I think, scarves and so on for the soldiers of war, which I think is very sweet. But the one on the right is very important. This is called the Sharpshooter. And this is going to be the first painting he's going to do later on. And this is called Sharpshooter on Picket Duty, and it's 1862. Now, this is a Union soldier, but what is important is that you find with Homer, he's always very interested in the new technologies, the way the technology is changing, and the scientific ideas. And it appears that this particular rifle had this amazing ability, so that you could literally pick off somebody 100 yards or something. And he said later on, he was terribly shocked by this, and he said later on it was the close. Well, he looked through one of these things, and he said it was the closest thing to murder he'd ever seen. He was rather distressed about it. But look at the drawing, and you see him hanging. This is his canteen hanging on the side there.
Oh, I thought that was like a tree knot.
No, it's his canteen.
Is he using it as a weight?
Probably, because when you see the painting, interestingly, this is 1862, by the way, and the detail is extraordinary, really. And he was in Virginia, and it was the Army of the Potomac. Now, what I hadn't quite realized was that in Virginia was a southern state, but Washington is in Virginia. And so the first big army was the Army of the Potomac, which is the name of the river. And this is the Union troops were successful. Let's put the next one on, and you see what happens to that drawing we've seen. Later on, in 1863, he decided somebody helped him taught him a little bit about painting, and he made that wood engraving into this painting. Isn't it extraordinary? Now you see missing is the thing on the side, the thing we were talking about. But here it isn't a beautiful, beautiful piece of painting, isn't it? It's probably the first one. It was in 1863. It's said to be, they don't really know. But I would urge you to look at the detail, particularly the detail of the boots and the uniform of this thing. I think it's tremendous. Now, the war the Confederates win to begin with, under Lee, and of course Lincoln is the president. Okay, next to, and the first and most successful of his paintings is called Home Sweet Home, and that's the one on the left. And this is 1863, the same year as the one we saw, the Sharpshooter. But the interesting thing about this is he doesn't ever do the drawings of the sort of the skirmishes and the actual violent war. They're always the ordinary soldiers, and the way that the soldiers are sort of longing for home. And always you find that his drawings are about that. I think this is terribly interesting. You see the same uniform, you see the funny boots and the funny tents at the back there. But the greatest and really the final important battle was the Battle of Petersburg. And the one on the right is the only time you ever see him drawing Confederate soldiers. And this particular Confederate shoulder is standing on the top. It's called Defiance. He's waiting to be shot. And it was the Battle of St. Petersburg. And this was 1864. So we're talking 63, 64. And of course, the war finally ends in 1865. And next one, we see, actually, interestingly, this is a very fascinating series. The figures on the right are Zouaves, Zouaves. Now, this it's so interesting because it's sort of contemporary. This particular colonel, who was called, who I think was called he was Ellsworth. He literally encouraged these they're actually Arabian soldiers, to come into a fight on the Union side. It appears that in the Crimean War, they were the most successful and violent soldiers, and they were terribly well known, and they wore this particularly funny uniform, and they became a sort of terribly fashionable, and everybody, lots of sort of ordinary Americans joined the same, and they wore this strange uniform. Now, the drawing at the top is very interesting. The top of the drawing there, you get to see how well already he was able to draw. Whilst he was in America, in New York, when he was just doing illustration, he did spend time at the Academy of Design in the Life Room, so he had some training by this time. But I think it's very interesting to see his drawing. And the one on the lower left is very interesting, because unlike all the other paintings of the Civil War, these are a black group, and they're fighting with the Union. But you see, then they've only got sort of rather strange bits of the uniform on. You see, they've got the same colour trousers, but on the whole, they don't have it. And this particular picture is called The Bright Side. And I love the look of the man sticking his head out of the door, the top there. And this one was not so successful, but the one on the right was tremendously successful. And it's called the Briarwood Pipe, because the man is making a pipe on the left, and the other one is holding a pipe in his hand, as you see. Okay, next one. And the next one is the most famous.
Oh gosh, this one's amazing.
This is the most amazing one. Now, this became the first time he became well known. This picture, in a way, he suffered from it. He said everybody always only talked about this work, and it's called Prisoners from the Front, and it's 1866. Now, this is very, very important to look at carefully, because it's really his attitude to the war generally. Because notice, they're all on the same level. You see the Union officer on the right, who incidentally, they think was a sort of a portrait of a colonel called Barlow. But look at the Confederate soldier in the center. And the man standing beside him, of course, is the soldier who is in charge of these people who are surrendering. And you see there's the old man, and there's really the strange group, and the guns on the front. Now, Camilla gave me lovely details of this, so we can see this in the next one, when you see the real thing. Because you can see the soldiers behind her, see. Look at the way, the strength, that the two men, you see, are on the same level. And this wonderful bit here with his coat undone, and the long hair, and the grey, and the stiffness of the other one. Now, this particular picture was very successful, and it was shown at the Academy of Design. And there was, at this time, we're talking 1867, there was an international exhibition in Paris. And this picture, and I think the Bright Side, the other one we saw, was sent to Paris. And so he went himself to Paris to see it. But what we're going to see now is the next one, and perhaps the most interesting of all of them. Because this picture, which is absolutely marvelous, is called The Veteran. But really, of course, it's very difficult to see it, but on the lower right here, you see the discarded coat the sort of the various, I think it's some bits of the soldier. That's his coat. As you see, he's taken his coat off, and really it's about what's happening after the war. And it has, I think, one of the most interesting, it's one of the most beautiful of all of them, this particular period. And it's his work, he's in the field, and this was 1865. And in 1867, as I said, the other one, by the way, was 1866, and this was 1865. And this is the veteran coming home from the war. And of course, this is a relatively Christian thing. Okay, next one. These, I think, are absolutely charming. And this is the kind of successful, you see, always you have to remember with Homer, Homer didn't have any money, and he was dependent upon his illustrations to make a living. Now, he was offered a permanent job by Harper's Weekly, but he refused it. All of his life, he said he didn't want to work for anybody. He didn't like being an apprentice to the first lithographer. That was enough for him. So all of his life, he refused to be settled down with any particular firm. And so he was freelance. And these particular pictures, the picture of the lower left is perhaps the one to look at, because that was one of the first ones. This is 1865. And here are the girls playing croquet. And the pictures on the top, the other one is the game of croquet, and that's 1866. And the other one, and the one, the lower one is later. This is Long Beach, New Jersey, 1869. Now the illustration was 1869 as well. This is the fashionable, what was happening, it was becoming fashionable to go to the seaside at the weekend. And the lower one is very important, the lower right one, because it shows the rather well-dressed women. It was all considered to be all right to go to the seaside. And there they all are in Long Beach, as I say, New Jersey. And I love the costumes. I think these lovely crinolines that they're all playing. This is the sort of thing. Now, this is literally what gave him any kind of income. He wasn't selling his pictures very well. I mean, they were showing them in the sort of the National Academy of Design but he wasn't making very much. If they were bought for a very low price. He was literally living off his illustrations, to be honest with you. Okay, next one. And of course, he went to Paris in 67. And what did he see? He saw Manet. And this is the Tuileries, the one that we now own. And this particular picture was painted in 1862. Now, in this international exhibition, which was huge in Paris, that Manet's work was not included in the salon part of it. Neither was Courbet's. Courbet opened his own gallery next door virtually, and so when Homer went to Paris, he went. Of course, he saw the work of Homer, and particularly Millet, because Millet had been known. Because his work had been shown in America before that. Millet he liked very much, and particularly Courbet. Courbet was interesting because he was, of course, a realist. Now, this particular picture was shown again in a private gallery. This was Manet. Manet had decided to follow Courbet's decision, and he had it actually in a sort of a private gallery. He showed about 50 of his works, and this was being shown at the time. So he would have seen this in 1867 when he got there, because this picture was painted in 1862. Okay, next one. But I don't know if he saw, I think he saw the Monet. At that particular time, this Monet painting was owned by Basile, and this was painted actually in 1866. It was painted the year before he got there. And of course, it's a very interesting one because Monet dug a sort of a trench and put his easel down in the trench. And his poor wife had to keep on changing all her clothes, swirling around the thick like. And of course, it was rejected, of course, but the exhibition, it was rejected by the Salon. And it was eventually bought by Basile. But the reason I've put the Hokusai on, because by 1867, the whole of Paris was aflame with interest in the new Japanese prints. And I've used this particular one because, of course, it's the sea, and it's the Hokusai one. You know, it's the great wave of Kanagawa of 1830. It's the famous one. But this is one he saw for the first time. He'd never seen, of course, anything like this before. When he was in Paris, he stayed in Paris for about six or 7 months, quite a long time. But he didn't paint in the city at all. He went to the landscape. He went outside just outside Paris and did a few landscapes, but he didn't bring much back to America, really. Okay, we'll have a look at the next one. Okay, but what he did see whilst in Paris was the Manets. And this is an important Manet. This particular one he was very impressed with because it's the battle of the Kearsarge and the Alabama. It actually Manet did see this. It took place off Cherbourg. And in fact, the Kearsarge shot the Alabama and was victorious. Of course, it's part of the American Civil War. And this was painted in 1864. And the picture on the right, of course, is the execution of Maximilian, which, of course, you know that we've got a version of it in the National Gallery. This particular one comes from Copenhagen. Manet did about 3 of them at the time. But the interesting thing is that I'm showing them to you because one, you'll notice later on, he'll be very interested in the way the sea is painted. In particular, you can see the person in the center. There's a sort of a figure. It's a rather frightening one. And the other one, of course, is of course about a conflict. It was in fact the French. This was done in Mexico. It was the French trying to put Maximilian in charge of their colony. And this question of his colonial interest in colonialism, you'll see much later. Okay, then we'll look at the next one. He came back to America, and one of the things that he'd seen whilst in Paris was the interest in the plein air painting. And he does this particular picture here, which is artists working in the White Mountains in 1868, and the other one is a drawing. Now, again, we're looking now post-Civil War, and there's a great obsession to try and get things as calm as possible. In fact, I think they lost a great deal of money. There was really a problem. It didn't end very well. But one of the things that became very fashionable was leaving the city in the very hot summer and going just outside the city, and particularly these White Mountains. And he was again, it was again, I think this is Harper's Weekly, and this was the engraving that he painted from, and this was a very fashionable thing to do at that time. Okay, next one. Now here you see more of these. These are really sort of tourist type paintings, but they were very, very bad. They were very much criticized. They were, of course, originally, they started off as wood engravings. And this one, The Bridle Path of the White Mountains, was painted in 1868. And it was very severely criticized because he'd learned from looking at Japanese prints It's very, very much flatter than is usual. Very difficult to see the disappearing background. And it was considered that she was badly dressed for this particular thing.
Don't worry, go on.
But what I want you to see is the top drawing. It's a beautiful piece of drawing. But you see, again, look at the influence of the Japanese print. Look at this strange, the drop from this rock, the man sitting on this rock, and this extraordinary drop. So you can see the river at the back. Beautiful piece of drawing. But these did not sell very well. He wasn't making any money with these. This is 1869, and the print was probably about. The print was published in 1870, and he was very, very severely criticised for his flatness. Okay, next one. But this is the first. You see, this one is very interesting because this was the first picture he did of women by the seaside, and this was absolutely attacked tremendously. How awful, they said, Mr. Homer should show us, be so extraordinary, the extraordinary rudeness of showing women's legs. How ghastly, women's legs and women's feet. Look at the clothes those poor women are having to swim in. I mean, can you imagine? But this was considered to be so extraordinarily vulgar. This hopeless. What was Mr. Homer thinking about was basically what they said, really. This was made in 1870, and they thought the subject was questionable. But what is interesting, look at the bathing suits, because later on, when you're going to see one of his final great pictures, you'll notice these terrible suits. They virtually weigh the people down when they're actually swimming. They're so heavy, you see. Look how covered
they are like cassocks.
They're terrible, aren't they? I love this one. Can you see the water? Isn't that splendid? The little dog and the water. The girl is putting out her. Can you see those things?
But the narrative of the mysterious sort of narrative of how they're all facing in different directions.
Isn't it odd? Isn't it?
And you can only see her face.
Yes, you can't see their face. Well, because you see, these were really very rude, showing their legs. I mean, they weren't even showing ankles at this point.
But it's kind of like the way that Homer, sort of the mystery of the stories that he tells.
Yes,
you don't quite exactly know.
You never know
what the dynamic is. So there's like a tension, right? It's almost like they form a triangle.
Yeah.
In a kind of Renaissance fashion, and then you don't know what the dynamic is exactly.
They're not looking at each other, as you say.
Well, she's looking at her, and it is kind of like a sort of strange look. Like what has just happened that we've come across? What is the scene that we've come across?
Interesting. The point that you make is so rightly. I ought to have said this at the beginning, but the interesting thing that makes him in a way different in terms of his realism from, for example, Courbet, you always have to remember that he was originally, he was an illustrator. He illustrated obviously story. And so behind most of his work is an unknown story. I won't say it's a story, but as you pointed out there, you're always concerned about what happened, what was happening, and what was the end of this association in a way which is very interesting. And this continues all through his life, really. Okay, next one. And this is this was very badly reviewed, by the way, and it didn't sell. But this is the first really, really successful painting he made after the veterans. I mean, the people coming back from the war, because this was very, very well received. And again, it's called Breezing Up the Fair Wind, and it was finished in 1873. And his brothers and he started to use the summertime in a place called Gloucester, Massachusetts, and it's by the sea. And there was a great deal of sort of amateurs sailing and so on. And this is a marvelous one because look at these little boys, all the little boys, and the old man in the center. And this wonderful, wonderful sea. There's some wonderful details Camilla's done with this one. If you look at those fish in the center. But the
You
point,
have to really look
oh,
at, you have
that's
to
so
really look right
you see
here.
here, you see there.
But the way that he centers it is
It's
amazing.
extraordinary.
Because the boy, so this is Pat and I were talking about this
Yeah.
from a cinematic point of view, because you would have to be bobbing in turbulent waters to be able to see this scene. So he sort of really sets up a kind of really lovely configuration, and it's very active and dynamic. And then you see the water sort of dangerously tipping in, and then there you see the little eyeballs of the fishes in that, you know, so close to water, but yet they're obviously captive.
And look at this boy, the way that he's pulling on that rope.
So there's a tension here, and then he's holding on to his ankle. And it's such a kind of loose, you know, boyish type of configuration, perfectly perched on the end, but totally in command.
And remember that the ship is called the Gloucester, which I think is interesting too, the little ship. This was a great success. This made his name pretty well known, this particular picture. It was one very, it was exhibited in American, again, in American Centenary exhibition at Philadelphia. And it was considered actually, very interestingly, a symbol of hope, because again, the post-war was very difficult. Okay, next two. This one I absolutely adore. This is one of my great favorites. And this is, these again are outside the Adirondacks, this particular group. And it is called a Snap the Whip. And it's 1862. Now, what I want to make a particular point about this, because to this day, when the Americans want to talk about the pride in their country, they always talk about the schoolhouse, the red schoolhouse. And in the background, you see the single red schoolhouse. And this was a sort of an example of the democracy, the democratic American way of life, because you have to remember that by this time, America was only 100 years old. Literally, the war against England was only 100 years. It was sort of 1760, I think, wasn't it? 1760 or something like that. It's only about 100 years. This is why the centennials we see all the time. But it's an astonishing. He did this painting 3 times. There were two examples of it. One had a mountain like this mountain in the background, but this particular one is in the Met. And it's about liberation, they think it's a free expression of liberation. And of course, what has happened was they were very proud of their education policy. They were educating everybody. This question, and everybody could read. Everybody, that is, who was white. We're going to be talking about this a little longer. The one on the right is really the same size as that one, but I could only get it in here. That's not in the exhibition. It's called Crossing the Pasture, and it's the same sort of thing. But what is interesting is there's always some sort of sense of tension in these pictures. If you look at these little boys, they're not looking happy. They're looking into the distance. They see something that we can't see. But it doesn't look happy. Somehow it looks as if there was something going to happen. And this is an absolutely wonderful look at these children, the little boy that's fallen down here.
And then this one pulling him back.
And it's just in the background, there's a church steeple, but you can only just see this. But most importantly, there are not a lot more of these schoolroom ones, but they're not in the exhibition, so I didn't put them in. Okay, next one. These are marvelous. These are the first time we see the watercolor. Now, what I should have told you at the beginning was that his mother was a very successful amateur watercolorist. She didn't show publicly, but she taught him watercolor. And can you see on the left, you can see his signature, Homer 73. Look at that painting, look at that drawing. It's called How Many Eggs? His titles are always quite interesting. They explain the thing. And obviously, there's the little boy and this man here. And this one, these incidentally were painted in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And this is called A Basket of Clams. And these are both, this one is a private collection, but this one is in the Met. And this is actually in the exhibition. Look at this painting. This was watercolor painting, absolutely extraordinary. Okay, next two. These are so interesting. Now, this is what happened in the South. Now, it's all very well to emancipate the slaves, but what do you do with them? How do they make a living? And this was one of the most terrible things that happened. And interestingly, Homer decided to go to find out to the place that he'd been in the war. This is in Virginia. And he wanted to see what had happened after the war. And what was this particular picture, which is very famous, is called A Visit from the Old Mistress. And this is 1876. Now just look at the way. Again, they're all on the same level. There's no question of her, but look at her straight back. And these women looking at her here. Now, what I've discovered by reading this splendid book that I was telling you about, I didn't know it until then, was that his middle brother, I think he was called Arthur, had become, as I say, a sort of civil servant. And he was sent by the government to Texas, this brother, as a sort of to try to organize the sort of the local people. And he discovered, the brother was very disturbed to discover the conditions of the freed slaves, most especially the children. And the children couldn't read. And so the brother decided that the most important thing was to get some schools together, but there was very, very little money. The government hadn't sent in much money, but all the ex-slaves, they got together, they cut down the wood and they built the schoolhouses. And when he'd finished his time in Texas, he was terribly proud because he'd managed to start 5 schools to teach Black children how to read. And I think this is behind the interest in the family to this situation is behind this painting. And I say I discovered it by this book. I didn't know this until I'd read the book, which is very interesting. Okay, there's some lovely details of this. These are the details. Look at the women. Look at the faces of the women. Suspicious, really. Why is she here? Isn't this interesting? Look at this careful painting. As I pointed out to the on Tuesday, the interesting thing, this woman sitting down, and you see her the flat of her hand, which is so much lighter in color. Marvelous situation. The look of the faces of this one and the mistress. The mistress, of course, covered in lace. They're just wearing sort of cast-off clothes. Okay, it's a beautiful picture, this one, I think. But this one is perhaps one of the most important. This one is the cotton pickers. And again, those, the released slaves still had to work for a living. And here are these women working in the fields, picking cotton. But look how enormously strong they are. There's no way that they're sort of downcast or pity me. look at their heads, look at their faces. This is in Los Angeles now. And of course, they're emancipated, but they still have to work for a living. And they're working in the same. And the interesting thing about this picture is that it was bought. There was an Englishman it was shown in the design exhibition in 1876, and he bought it and brought it back to England. And this is the first WINSLOW HOMER the British saw. It was exhibited in the Royal Academy in 1878. And I would remind you that at the same time as this, this is probably the first time, well, this is the first time the English ever see a Homer picture, and this is the one they see, which I think is very interesting. Let's look at the next one, because this one is wonderful. This is this dressing for the carnival, and this is 1877. Now, it appears that this particular carnival idea came from the Bahamas, and it was picked up by the black ex-slaves, and that they have this sort of carnival once a year, and the two details are the real color. These again are Kundera's details. Just look at the way the paint, look at the clothes, look at the patches on these trousers. Isn't that interesting? The care with which he's painted, and look at him holding the flag, and the woman here with her pipe in this very glamorous outfit that they're building for it. This is a beauty, I think. This is 1877. And as I say, the idea of this particular thing came from the West Indies, really. Okay, next one. He came to England the second time. Now, why did he come to England? And again, I hadn't known this until I read this book. He wanted to see Turner. Why? Because he'd seen one Turner painting earlier, which had belonged to a rather one of his early patrons, and he came to England, back to England in 1881, and he painted the only painting he painted in London. The watercolor was here, is the Houses of Parliament. And of course, Monet is going to paint exactly the same thing a bit. And what he saw, which is very, very important, was the Parthenon marbles at the British Museum. Now, these are going to be very important because it's the first time ever he has seen classical sculpture. And we're going to see the way this changes his drawing later on. He didn't stay in London very long. He stayed in him for about a month. Now, what is interesting, what I again discovered from this book, which I didn't know, is that the Victoria and Albert Museum had been built, and the Queen had lent the Raphael cartoons. So he was able to see the Raphael cartoons when he was in London. But more importantly, Turner had died, and he'd given his entire collection of pictures to the state. But by now, the Tate has not yet been built. And so in the Victoria and Albert, at the same time in 81, he saw the entire collection of Turner's work. And I think this is very interesting. Now, at the time, a fashionable place for artists, I didn't know this, was this very, very strange place, which was outside Newcastle, and it was called Cullercoats. And it was a North Sea, came to North, it was Fisher Place, and it became a kind of little artist colony. Artists began to go to paint the sea there. And so he stayed about a month in London, they think, and he went off to this Cullercoats place almost after a month. Okay, next one. Now, what he did see had seen before, though, and this is very important, this is what started his interest in Turner, was this incredible painting of Turner's, which is now in Boston, and it's called The Slave Ship. And it was bought by this one of his early patrons, and he actually saw this when it was first came to America. It was painted in 1840, and it is slavers throwing overboard the dead and the dying. And as I say, this particular man called Taylor had bought it, and eventually he gave it to the Boston Museum, which is where you can see it now. Can you see this picture? It's terribly important. Look at the train, the iron thing, and the figures up here, and that incredible, almost crucifix shape of the light. It's an amazing picture, and this is one that started. This is the major reason for him coming to England. He wanted to see Turner's. Okay, next one. Now, this is this extraordinary place, Cullercote. Now, as I said, it had become a sort of an artist centre. So I put on the left a painting, actually, which is over by the Queen, by Frank Hull. And he was a very fashionable painter. And funnily enough, he also was an illustrator. But this is called No Word from the Sea. And this is the Royal Academy. This was in the Royal Academy of 1871. It was commissioned by the Queen. And this is the picture on the right is his first watercolor. Now, whilst he was in Cullercote, he mostly painted. He did paint, I think it was one oil painting, but basically he painted in watercolor because he could transfer it easily. Now, when he got there, he had a room in a house which was right next to the place where the boats,
where
the lifeboat came from. And this is what we're seeing here. They're actually preparing to launch a lifeboat here with all the people. It's called Watching the Tempest, and it was painted. It was one of the first ones. It was painted in 1881. Now, the astonishing thing, he expected to stay there for about a month. In fact, he stayed 18 months, and it really changed the way he painted. Let's have a look at the next ones. They are marvelous. This one on the left was a wreck that he actually saw, and this is called the wreck. The ship is called the Iron Crown. The Iron Crown, and it was wrecked, and in 1881, and he does this first watercolor of it, and he did witness this actually. But the one on the right, I think, is absolutely wonderful. It's from his house, looking out towards the sea. And this one is the two watchers, and the part which they call the perils of the sea. And this is now in Williamstown, which you see the women. The interesting thing about this whole group is this way he began to paint women. These very, very strong women. I mean, they repaired the nets, they dealt with the fish, and they looked after the family. They're very strong, and we actually know the name of one of the women that he looked after. Let's put the next two on, and you can see it. I think they're quite remarkable. This is the three fisherwomen. Look at their clothes and look at the way they stand, and the marvelous sense of the light. And the two here, the fisher girls on the shore, and these are both 1881. They're really strong. They're like the cotton pickers, really. Okay, next one. And this lady at the top is lovely. I found this lovely article about her. She's called Maggie Jefferson, and she was his favorite model. And she was 16 coming up 16 when she was here. And here she is in all of these pictures. This is the fisher girl on the beach of 81, and the other one is the fisher girl and this is actually an oil painting. This was painted after he got back to America. So strong with it. This is a marvelous drawing, which we still have the whole thing. He took them back and he kept on working on these figures and this particular group from Color Codes for 2 years. And at this particular moment, his family had bought land in Prout's Neck in Maine. And so this is where he finally ended his life, really. Okay, let's look at the other two. These are lovely. They're so incredibly strong. Usually this girl, the ladies on Tuesday were much impressed with her shoes. I gather they're fashionable now. I didn't know about that, but that's what they said. This is called Inside the Bar. And he returned in 82, but he continued to paint the subjects until 84, same subjects. And then he did them in oil. This particular one is in oil. And this is 83. This particular one is 1883. There's a detail there of that one. Okay, next one. Aren't they incredible? And this is called The Gale. And this is oil. This is 83 to 93. What he tended to do, and something we didn't really sort of only beginning to really know, he worked again and again and again on the painting. He didn't necessarily sell them. By now, his work, he started to make money in about 75. Before this, he was incredibly poor. What he actually began to sell were his watercolors, and he managed to make a living from these watercolors. He sold them for very good prices, and the watercolors became very successful. There was a sort of an institute, a sort of of watercolors in Washington. And isn't this a wonderful one? You see the detail that Camilla's done for us. The little baby, look, that little baby, the little eyes looking out. Look, isn't it God lovely? Look at the clouds.
And everything has this like linearity.
It's extraordinary.
So the horizon line,
yeah, always.
The crest of that wave, her arm, everything. It's like he sort of layers things again in a very cinematic way.
Well, you call it cinematic, but actually his geometry. He was fascinated by geometry, actually.
Yeah.
And he was a very interesting man.
You can actually feel the elements.
You can, with every sense, you get the sense of wetness of it all. And this is when this particular one, of course, became the most famous. And this is called The Lifeline. And this became, after the one we've just seen, this became his most famous picture. Now, again, it was something about both the sea and a new invention. And what they'd actually done, they discovered this line here. It was a rescue thing. It was rescued from a shipwrecked passenger boat. And it's called a breeches life-saving buoy. And what is so interesting in this is, again, think about the sort of the modesty of the time of women. Now we see the woman's face and we actually see her legs, but interestingly, we don't see the face of her rescuer. We just see his body, but the red, to save her modesty, they say later on. There's some details now, what the next one on. This one is the one that I was talking about, those terrible costumes. And this particular one, of course, is these poor women were literally almost drowned, and they're being rescued. It's called the undertow. But look at the figure on this figure here of this man, and you see the importance of his interest in the antique sculpture. Now you begin to see it in the particular position of the men. He really can draw with great incredible. I mean, it's very, very good stuff. And this one again was 1886. And as I say, it's a use of antique sculpture, really. He was by now, in 85, his brothers, his rather wealthy brothers, had bought a great deal of land on this in Maine, on the seascar, and they built themselves a house, but in the land there was a sort of an old barn, and he transferred it into a studio, and he began to spend more and more time there, and he left New York City. He had a studio in 10th Street, which was rather there was an organization that had a lot of artists in it, but he didn't spend much time there. He began to spend more and more time in Maine. Okay, next one, and here are the details. Look at the girl's face. Isn't that amazing? You can see the wet. And here, this one I think is terribly interesting. Look at her arm as it comes down, and his hand, and her hand. When you think that this man was self-taught, isn't this amazing? This sort of drawing. Okay, next one. Because this was, he now begins these wonderful, for which is now tremendously famous, the sea pictures. And this is called The Fog Warning. And it was painted in 1885. And it really was because of his interest in it's really the fishermen of the North Atlantic. They're collecting halibut. They have to go quite way out. And as you see, this particular sailor has seen, presumably, a ship at the side. Is that the moon? One doesn't know. But look at this and look at the detail. There's a fearsome feeling about this picture. You really do get it, the deep sea. And it really was extraordinary. But this particular picture was tremendously successful, and he was given the gold medal of the National Academy. He was now a full-scale member of the National Academy. He was now getting very well paid and very well. By this time, by the 85, he's famous. Okay, next one. We love this one. This is in the exhibition, and we just adored this one. Again, it's his interest in new developments, because this is the Saxon. They're taking a reading on the Saxon here, you see. And the other one, it's the people are sort of sorting out which part of the sea they are, I gather. It's called 8 Bells, and it refers to the way they tell time, and when they look at through the Saxon thing, they do it at 4, 8, and 12 a.m. and p.m. This particular one is 8. Look at this painting. Look at the painting of the coat here. The detail of this. Isn't it extraordinary? Again, you have this tremendous sense of time, don't you? Sort of time suspended, really. He says this, he says he's a great observer. He talks about time being very important, and sort of live at the moment you've got. It's a marvelous one, this one. It's 86. But this, of course, is the one that really, really, really is known for. This is called the Gulf Stream. And this is, of course, down in Bermuda. And this particular picture has become the most important picture he ever painted. And look at this broken boat. You know, the broken mast here and the sail overseas. And here, the sugar cane, and again a black man. Is he going to die? Look at the sharks. But in the distance, and it appears later on, he didn't do it straight away, but later on, he showed, he painted this little boat in the background there. Is it going to be in time? One doesn't know. And it's tremendously fearful, this one. And this one is the one that really he's most famous for. It was started in 85, but it was never really finished. And look at this color, this slight red here. I mean, is this blood? Look at this.
There's a sort of like typhoon.
Typhoon coming up, isn't there? Everything. Look at the terrifying sharks. Broken boat. Some marvelous paintings. Okay, next one. Here are the details. And the drawing is what they've got for it, this one. Isn't it amazing? Look at these faces of these.
And the sugar cane.
Oh, the sugar cane. He went, the winters, I gather, in Maine are absolutely dreadful. And so when he had enough money, he started to go every summer, every winter down. And he went for about sort of 10, 15 years. He used to go to Nassau, to all over Florida, and eventually Cuba, the Bahamas. And this is when these wonderful watercolors come. Between 84 and 1909, he went. And he traveled frequently, and as I said, to the tropics. And he had some commissions about them, but these are the ones that really made him the money. His mother dies earlier. He was very close to his mother, not so much for his father, but for some reason he's tremendously cut up when his father dies. I think his father went to live with him, and he died in 1898. And that is when he felt more clearly to be able to go to Nassau more frequently. And the one on the top one there is a garden in Nassau in 1885. And the one underneath it is a wall. But 10 years later, this is 98, that's 85, not quite 10 years, but this is it here. Look at those oranges, they're 85. And the Natural Bridge in Bermuda is 1901. So you're looking at quite a period of time in these. Aren't they the most? I think he's the best watercolorist I've ever seen, really. Mm. And the color is this is astonishing. Is this man dead? We don't know. The broken boat. You always get the sense of fear, really, with these things, awful. It's called After the Hurricane, and it was 1889. Now, the other one is called The Turtle Pond, and this is 1898. And what I hadn't realized until again this famous book that I'd read is that the Nassau was becoming very, very fashionable, and people were spending their winters there. And in one of them, it said the turtle, which used to be sort of the main meal of the local people, became too expensive for them. All the rich people on holiday would eat them. The interesting thing always here, he always paints notes the local people, the local fishermen. And quite often it's interesting. The boats are white usually, and the men, of course, are. This one, and is he dead? We don't really know. But they really are extraordinary. Okay, next one. Look at these. Look at this one. Isn't that amazing? This again is Nassau. The Bather is 1899, and the underneath one is 1899. And look at the interesting thing. I hadn't realized this, but you see, this particular area used to be Spanish territory, and these are old guns on the front here. So there's a reference to colonialism here. And again, people in the boats, even though the boats are probably for the visiting tourists, they're the black people. And look at this one with the shark, the sharks again. Isn't this astonishing? This particular one is sharks at 85, and it's just called the derelict one. This one is now owned by now in Brooklyn. The others are in the Met. Okay, next one. This is so interesting. Now we see his attitude to the north. I mean, this is the Adirondacks, and it appears that he used to spend, so they say, he used to spend a lot of time with the hunting group, and the people came usually from New York City, usually businessmen, and they were hunting the deer. And this particularly astonishing painting is this little boy having the gun in the boat, having shot the deer and pulling the dead deer's head from underneath. And here is the dog, what they did, which was quite awful. The dogs used to chase from the woods. They used to chase the deer into the water, and the men would shoot them then. And this is what we're seeing here. Look at the detail of this. Look at the little eye of the deer. Isn't it incredible? This wasn't a particularly successful painting. The people were very upset about the deer, quite rightly too, I think, really. But it didn't really what. He writes to his brother. He himself thought very highly of the picture. He thought it was one of his best pictures. It was one that gave him a lot of trouble. He painted it for a long time. It started in 1892, but it was not exhibited much later. And he said in a letter, I spent more than a week painting those hands, he said in a letter to his brother. And the country boys shot the deer in the water. And he was very worried about the people were very worried about the eyes. It's very, very interesting. This is a detail. Okay, next one, but this one is terrifying. This I saw myself in Philadelphia years ago, and I've never forgotten it. And it's called The Fox Hunt. And they really think that this is extraordinary. This old fox is being attacked by these hungry, these terrible crows. Look at the size of them. Will he make it or won't he make it? Look at the water behind here, the snow here. This is actually in the Pennsylvania Academy. Little bits here. Will he make it to safety, or will the crows get him? The low viewpoint, this is another one, very much influenced by Japanese prints. It's really quite extraordinary. And these particular ones from this time were sort of about a struggle for survival. All of them are the same. The last one was the Adirondack. That was a little earlier, because this one, Fox Hunt, is 93. Okay, next one. These are terrifying. Can you see the boat? Yeah. They shot the ducks. The ducks are dying.
So the shot is coming from here.
Yeah.
And this is the just killed duck.
Yes, just killed duck. Isn't it ghastly? It's called Right and Left, and it's late. He dies in 1910. It was painted in 1909. He had a stroke in 1909, but he still had in 1906 he had a stroke. And he writes to his brother, I paint relentlessly. In 1909, he was still working feverishly. I can't accept your invitation for Thanksgiving. I have little time for anything. I'm painting driftwood. This is 99. That was his last painting. And we're not quite clear which, this one has been shot, I think, but is this one getting away? We don't know. Can you see this in the background here? Extraordinary. Absolutely dreadful. It was painted a year before his death. Okay, next one. This is marvelous.
I love this.
This is the most astonishing one. It's called a Northeaster. It was started in 95, but it was reworked in 1901. And the detail is quite remarkable. All the last water ones are just extraordinary. There are rarely people in them. The last one he was painting. The next one that we're committed to detail. Look at that detail. Isn't it extraordinary? The way the urgency of the paint quality.
But it's also
Beautiful.
rather timely to see
Yeah.
his work now,
Isn't
because
it? Yeah.
you kind of he's very apposite for our current sort of involvement with climate
Of
change
course.
and with obviously our
Conditions.
the conditions of our planet. And so the way that he paints, I mean, this is devoid of humans, of any sort of bodies,
Oh, yes.
but the way that he treats the actual like material of the earth, the rocks and the water,
It's
and
marvelous.
the kind of the powers
Yeah.
that sort of
And
control all of
and
these
you know,
things.
the way that the sea is absolutely, they can't do anything about it. You know, there's the floods
Yeah.
that we're getting now. This beautiful piece of work, this one,
The rock is just so
just
beautiful.
incredible, beautiful
Love the
piece
way
of
he
work.
does geology.
And this is the last picture. This is the one he was painting that he went and wrote to his brother. And it's called, this particular one, it is called The Driftwood. It's in Boston. And there's just one figure here, this huge piece of wood here. And that's the real color. This is from the book, but this is, Camilla took it from the best. And I'm going to end with showing you his house. Now, this is what it looks like now. But this particular picture here was photographed in 1895. What I omitted to tell you was that his use of photography, it was known that he had 3 cameras. Now, how much he used these cameras, we don't know. And you know, this question of him being completely silent and by himself, and a bit of they think he might have had a after the war, it might have caused him to have a mental condition.
You said he had like PTSD.
That is what they think now. But the other thing that's worth mentioning is that, you see, I told you originally these brothers had bought this masses of land on this Prout's Neck. And can you see in the contemporary photograph, look how close the houses are now. And actually, all round, you can visit his studio. They've made it so that you can visit it now. But you see, already it was a great place in summertime. Lots and lots and lots of people came. It was not. I mean, although he lived alone, he wasn't without friends. There's no doubt about it. He had a great circle of friends, but very mysterious. Nobody knows much about his love life, if anything. Okay.